I honestly thought that the hardest thing I would ever have to do in my life was watch my daughter's chest rise and fall under the hum of a ventilator, wondering if it would be the last time I ever saw her breathe. I was wrong. The hardest thing I've ever had to do is realize that the people I love, the people who are supposed to be in our corner, might actually be exploiting my child's trauma for a performative sense of moral superiority, even if they don't realize they're doing it. How do you tell a woman who has showered your baby with nothing but love and gifts that she has inadvertently turned your daughter's brush with death into a marketing prop for the wrong charity? And when the weight of that realization hits you, how do you fix it without burning down the only support system you have left? The silence in our house at night is different now than it was a year ago. When my daughter was in the hospital, the silence was heavy, thick with the smell of antiseptic and the terrifying rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor. Those first 7 months were a blur of grey walls, surgical consultations, and the suffocating realization that my child, my tiny, innocent baby, was literally fighting for every single heartbeat. We weren't supposed to be here. The doctors, the incredible, brilliant, miracle-working team at Children's Minneapolis, they were honest with us. They told us the odds. They told us that the path ahead was a minefield, and they told us that there was a very real, very terrifying chance we would be walking out of that hospital alone. But she didn't leave alone. She fought with a ferocity that defied biology, a stubborn little spirit that refused to quit. She clawed her way back from the edge of the abyss, and today she is the happiest 14-month-old you will ever meet. She has a smile that can dismantle your entire world and put it back together in a better shape. She's a warrior, but she's a warrior who is going to be in that hospital for the rest of her childhood. She's going to need multiple open-heart surgeries as she grows, more procedures than any human should have to endure in a lifetime. We are still in the thick of it. We are still counting heartbeats and praying for progress, and every single time we walk through the doors of the cardiac center, I am reminded of who actually saved her life. It wasn't a national brand. It wasn't a billboard charity. It was the people in our city who dedicated their lives to congenital heart defects. The silent, invisible epidemic that affects 40,000 children in this country every single year. That brings me to my mother-in-law. She is a soft-spoken woman, a person who exists on the periphery of social grace, often fidgeting with her hands, clearly uncomfortable in her own skin when things get too loud or too complicated. She is the embodiment of kind, the kind of person who shows her love through thoughtful gifts and a deep respect for our boundaries. She has never overstepped, never tried to take over, and has been a constant, gentle presence in our daughter's life. She has this small social circle, a group of people who love their classic cars, a community that feels safe and grounded for her. Every year, they organise a St. Jude ride, a charitable event where they cruise their cars to raise money. It's a nice thing to do. It's objectively good to raise money for sick children, but for the last 2 years I've had to look at a photograph of my daughter plastered onto the back of a classic car, surrounded by stickers and decals advertising that St. Jude's charity. It's not just a photo, it's a narrative. It's the visual shorthand for help the sick child, and it is fundamentally, gut-wrenchingly wrong. My daughter has never set foot in a St. Jude's. She doesn't owe her life to them. She owes her life to the cardiac specialists at Children's Minneapolis, who receive a fraction of the funding, a fraction of the public attention, and a fraction of the gratitude that massive national organizations do. It's a math problem that feels like a betrayal. Childhood cancer is horrific. I would never, ever take away from the suffering those families endure. But when you look at the funding, childhood heart defects are being left in the dust. They receive about 1/5 of the funding for research compared to cancer, despite the sheer number of children suffering from them. And there my daughter is, being used to bridge that gap for an organization that had absolutely nothing to do with her survival. I sat there at my kitchen table, staring at a picture of the car on my phone, feeling a hot, sharp sting of resentment that I couldn't quite put down. It feels gross. It feels like someone decided that my child was a sick kid icon, a generic face to put on a poster to make people feel better about donating, without even taking the 2 minutes to ask, "Hey, who actually saved this little girl?" It's the commodification of a trauma that we are still actively living through. I want my daughter's story to be used to help the people who actually helped her. I want that recognition, that money, and that awareness to go to the team that held her heart in their hands. I turned to my husband last night, the man who held my hand through the worst months of our lives, and I told him, "I can't do this anymore. We need to say something." I saw the apprehension in his eyes immediately. He knows his mother. He knows how fragile her social confidence is. He knows that asking her to tell her friends, people she clearly feels a sense of belonging with, that they've been using our daughter's image incorrectly is going to mortify her. He's worried it will ruin her little group, make her feel like an outcast, or worse, make her feel like a failure. But I'm worried about my daughter. I'm worried about the principle of the thing. Am I being heartless? Am I the asshole for wanting to force a confrontation that will almost certainly shatter my mother-in-law's fragile peace of mind? I watched my husband, Mark, rub his temples, the lines of stress around his eyes deepening as he processed what I had just said. He is a good man, a man who desperately wants to protect the peace. But he knows me too. He knows that when I say I've reached my limit, it isn't because I'm looking for a fight. It's because the internal pressure of keeping quiet has become more painful than the potential fallout of speaking up. He sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to pull the oxygen out of our living room. He didn't argue with me. How could he? He was there in the hospital too. He remembers the sterile smell of the NICU, the way the light hit our daughter's pale skin when she was hooked up to more machines than I could count. He knows that the money and the awareness matter, but he also knows his mother. His mother is the kind of person who apologizes for bumping into a piece of furniture. She is the kind of person who would rather endure a mild internal crisis than ask a waiter for a refill of water. To her, this St. Jude ride isn't just a charity event. It's her social anchor. It's where she feels useful. It's where she feels like she is part of something bigger than her own awkwardness. To ask her to walk up to the organizers of that event, people she has likely spent years trying to impress or fit in with, and tell them they've been using a photo of our daughter incorrectly. To her, that won't feel like a correction. It will feel like an accusation. It will feel like she's being told she was the bad grandmother who didn't pay attention. I know it sounds trivial to some. I can already hear the voices of the people who would say, "It's for charity, get over it." But it's not just a picture. It's a narrative that we didn't consent to. Every time she puts that decal on a car, she is essentially telling the world, this is what a childhood illness looks like, and here is where you should put your money. By using a face that the community knows, a child they've seen growing up, she is leveraging our private, agonizing journey to bolster a reputation for a specific charity that, frankly, didn't earn that specific credit. I've been replaying the conversation in my head over and over. I asked Mark, does she even know? And he didn't have an answer. Maybe she thought all big medical charities are the same. Maybe she thought, well, sick kid equals St. Jude's. And that was the end of her thought process. It wasn't malicious. I know that in my heart. But the lack of malice doesn't erase the impact. If I stay silent, I am essentially saying that it is okay for our daughter's struggle to be used as a prop, as long as the people using her have good intentions. But what happens when she's older? What happens when she's 5 or 10 or 15, and she starts to realize that her face was used to raise money for a place that didn't save her? Is she going to feel like her story was stolen? I feel a profound sense of responsibility toward the medical team at Children's Minneapolis. They are our heroes. They are the ones who performed the miracles, who stayed late, who called us at home to check on her progress. They are underfunded, overworked, and constantly battling against the massive, polished marketing machines of the national charities. When I see that decal, I don't just see a picture of my daughter. I see a missed opportunity. I see a chance to educate people about congenital heart defects, a chance to show them that there is a different kind of fight being fought in local hospitals every single day. If we shifted that focus, even a little, it could help other families like ours. It could mean better equipment, more research, more resources for the next set of parents who are sitting in that waiting room, terrified and alone. But then the guilt hits. It's a cold, sharp feeling in my gut. I see my mother-in-law's face when she gives our daughter a hand-knitted blanket or a simple toy. I see the way she tries so hard to show she cares. She is so fragile. Is this the hill I want to die on? Is this worth breaking the trust of someone who has been a pillar of support for us? I keep asking myself, am I being a monster? Am I placing my own frustration and principle above the feelings of an elderly woman who has nothing but love in her heart? The conflict feels like a tightrope walk. One side is the integrity of our daughter's story and the necessity of supporting those who actually saved her. The other side is the preservation of a delicate, loving, and vulnerable family relationship. I looked at Mark and I said, I don't want her to feel attacked. I don't want to ruin her event. But I can't look at that car anymore. I can't look at my daughter's face being used like a generic symbol of sickness while the real heroes are ignored. He looked at me, and for a second I saw his resolve harden. He didn't say yes, and he didn't say no. He just stood up, paced the room, and said, "She's going to be devastated, you know, not because she doesn't care, but because she's going to feel like she failed at the one thing she thought she was doing right." The weight of that sentence hit me harder than I expected. Is there a way to do this that doesn't shatter her? Is there a way to be honest without being cruel? I feel like I'm standing on the edge of a decision that will define how our family functions for years to come. If I push this, I change the dynamic. If I don't, I keep a piece of myself hidden, buried under the weight of a secret resentment that I know will only grow with every passing St. Jude ride. The tension in our house wasn't just about the decal. It was about the collision of two different worlds. On one side, there was the world of the hospital, a place where life and death are measured in millimeters and milliliters, where everything is high stakes and nothing is sugar-coated. In that world, you learn quickly that there is no room for ambiguity. You advocate for your child because if you don't, no one else will. On the other side was my mother-in-law's world, a world of social etiquette, quiet gestures, and the desperate need to keep things pleasant and manageable. To her, a charity is a charity. It's a good thing. It's a box you check to be a good person. She doesn't see the systemic inequity of medical funding. She doesn't see the irony of using a heart warrior to fund a cancer research-focused institution. She just sees a smiling baby and a way to help. But that simplicity is exactly what burns me. It's the ignorance that hurts, even when I know it's not malicious. I spent the evening looking through my daughter's photos. I found the ones from the ICU, the ones that make me weep even now, months later. I looked at the monitors and the tubing, the sheer physical reality of her struggle. Then I looked at the photo my mother-in-law had been using, a professional, sweet, happy photo of her taken months after she was home. It was the after picture. It was the face of the miracle, but it lacked the context of the war. By using that specific image, the charity gets the glory of the happy ending without having to engage with the gritty, painful reality of the heart defect that nearly killed her. I realized then that my frustration wasn't just about the money. It was about erasure. My daughter's survival is a testament to the specific, specialized, and often overlooked brilliance of the cardiac team. When you attribute that survival to the St. Jude brand, you aren't just raising money for the wrong place. You are effectively telling the world that she survived because of the idea of a sick child, rather than the specific medical intervention of a local, under-resourced unit. It feels like a theft of her narrative. I tried to explain this to Mark, but my voice started to shake. I told him, "It feels like she's a doll, a little mascot. And I know your mum thinks she's doing the right thing, but she's just not seeing the person behind the photo." Mark finally sat back down, putting his head in his hands. He admitted that his mother had mentioned how proud she was to have her granddaughter's photo on the car. She had been showing it to her friends, bragging about how her granddaughter was the face of the fundraiser. The thought of that made my stomach turn. She wasn't just using the photo, she was making it her identity within that group. She was the grandmother of that girl on the car. If I demand she take it down, I am stripping away a piece of the pride she has built. I am telling her, "You aren't the hero grandmother you think you are. You're actually a part of the problem." How do you say that to a woman who has only ever tried to be kind? It felt like an impossible choice. Either I sacrifice my integrity and my daughter's story, or I sacrifice my relationship with a woman who has genuinely been a part of our village. But then I thought about the future. I thought about the next surgery. I thought about the fact that this is a cycle. If this keeps happening, if the pattern repeats, when does it stop? If I don't set this boundary now, at 14 months, what happens when she's 10? Will she be expected to participate in these things? Will she be forced to stand next to a car with her own face on it, representing a charity that didn't save her? The thought sent a jolt of protective adrenaline through me. I realized that my reluctance wasn't just about my mother-in-law's feelings. It was about my own fear of being the villain in our family dynamic. I realized that I have been hiding behind the polite daughter-in-law mask for too long. I've been so worried about being the a-hole that I've allowed my own boundaries to be trampled. But this isn't about me. This is about my daughter's medical history. This is about the reality of CHD. And if I am truly the advocate she needs me to be, I have to be willing to be the person who brings the uncomfortable truth to the table. I have to be the one who says the hard thing, even if it makes the room go cold. I looked at Mark and I said, "We have to do this. But we do it with as much grace as possible. We don't attack her. We don't make it about her failure. We make it about the why. We give her the facts. We show her the disparity in the funding, and we explain, clearly and gently, that we need the focus to be on the place that actually saved her life. If she's the person I think she is, a person who loves her granddaughter more than she loves her social image, she will understand. And if she doesn't, then we have a much bigger problem." Mark looked at me, and for the first time, he nodded. It wasn't a happy nod, and it wasn't a relieved one, but it was an agreement. The decision was made. The confrontation was coming. But as I sat there in the dark, the weight didn't lift. It just shifted from my heart to my throat. I knew this was going to be the most difficult conversation we'd had in years. The days leading up to that conversation with my mother-in-law felt like a slow-motion countdown. I spent hours staring at my daughter while she played, watching the faint silvery line of her incision, the permanent map of her journey. And I kept thinking about how easy it is to sanitize a child's trauma for a pamphlet. I wondered if my mother-in-law had ever actually asked the organizers, who saved her? Or did she just hand them the photo, beaming with pride, and let them weave whatever story they wanted for the sake of a fundraising goal? The lack of inquiry felt like an insult, even if it was born from a place of ignorance. I decided that the only way to do this was to treat my mother-in-law like the person I know she is. Kind, thoughtful, and deeply, if sometimes blindly, devoted. I couldn't go in with anger. If I went in with anger, she would shrink. She would retreat into that shell of awkwardness, and the point would be lost. This had to be about education, not accusation. I had to show her the data, the 40,000 children, the stark reality of the funding gap, and the specific, life-saving debt we owe to the team at Children's Minneapolis. I wanted her to see that her fundraising efforts were noble, but the target was misaligned with the reality of our family's life. When the time finally came, we invited her over for dinner. The house was quiet, the air thick with an unspoken anxiety that I could tell she sensed. She arrived with a small bag of clothes for our daughter, her face lighting up with that genuine, unforced warmth she always has. Watching her play with my daughter on the living room rug, I felt a familiar pang of guilt. It's hard to be the one to bring the storm into a quiet house. But then, my daughter turned, and I caught a glimpse of her profile, the way her neck curved, the quiet strength in her eyes. And I remembered the long nights in the ICU. I remembered the doctors telling us, "We're going to try everything." They fought for her. They deserve the credit. They deserve the funding. I waited until after dinner, when the tea was poured and the house was settling into the evening lull. I took a deep breath, and I looked at Mark. He gave me a small, encouraging nod. He was going to let me take the lead. I started by talking about how much we appreciate her. I told her how she's been a rock, how she's always respected our boundaries, and how much we love that she's so involved in our daughter's life. I softened the ground before I started to dig. I told her, "Mum, there's something that's been weighing on me for a long time, and I need to talk to you about the car show and the charity ride. I know you're doing this because you love her, and I know how proud you are to share her story. But there's a part of it that's hurting me." Her face changed instantly. The warmth didn't leave, but it was replaced by a look of profound confusion and subtle, immediate hurt. She didn't say anything. She just leaned back, clutching her mug, her knuckles white. I explained the reality of the hospital. I told her, as gently as I could, that our daughter wasn't a St. Jude's kid. I told her about the specific, grueling, and underfunded nature of congenital heart defect research. I told her about the 40,000 children, the 5-to-1 funding ratio, and the specific team at Children's Minneapolis who had literally held my daughter's life in their hands. I didn't frame it as, "You did this wrong." I framed it as, "I need your help to make this right." I asked her if, in the future, she could either advocate for cardiac-specific charities or, at the very least, stop using a photo of our daughter to represent an organization that played no part in her survival. She sat in complete, agonizing silence for what felt like 10 minutes. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, and I could see the gears turning. I could see the shame, the kind of shame that comes when you realize your good deed wasn't as good as you thought. She looked so fragile, so small, and for a moment, I wanted to reach out, take it all back, and tell her to just keep doing what she was doing. But I didn't. I held my ground, waiting for her to speak. When she finally looked up, her eyes were glassy, and her voice was a whisper. I just wanted to help," she said. "I thought it was the right thing to do." "I know it was," I replied, my voice steadying. "And I know your heart was in the right place. But help me change the focus. Help me ensure that when people see her face, they're being directed to the people who are actually fighting the battle she fought." It wasn't a perfect resolution. There was no big hug, no immediate aha moment of profound clarity. It was a messy, painful, and deeply uncomfortable exchange. She felt embarrassed, and I felt like a monster for making her feel that way. But, as the conversation wound down, I saw something shift in her expression. It was a realization. She began to ask questions. She asked about the doctors, about the specific equipment the hospital needed, and about the nature of the advocacy. She was listening. She wasn't just defending herself. She was actually taking in the gravity of the situation. I didn't ask her to go out and publicly shame her friends. I didn't ask for an apology from the car club. I just asked for a pivot. And as she left that night, she didn't look like the same woman who had walked in. She looked like someone who had been given a new, perhaps more important responsibility. I wondered if I had done the right thing, or if I had simply disrupted a fragile, happy dynamic for the sake of a principle that would only cause more friction later. The house felt colder after she left, and the silence was no longer the peaceful kind. It was the kind that follows an explosion. The days following that dinner were defined by a strange, hollowed-out silence. It wasn't that my mother-in-law stopped calling, or that she acted out in some dramatic, obvious way. She is far too conflict-averse for that. It was more like she had retreated into a shell, the kind of quiet withdrawal that makes you wonder if you've permanently damaged a foundation you spent years building. I kept replaying the conversation in my mind, picking apart my own words like a surgeon. Was I too harsh? Did I deliver the truth with enough kindness? Or did my own exhaustion and trauma seep into the delivery and turn it into a condemnation? I started to second-guess everything. Maybe I was the asshole. Maybe I was so caught up in the rightness of my cause, this crusade for congenital heart defect awareness, that I completely ignored the emotional landscape of the people around me. I had forced an elderly, socially anxious woman to confront the fact that her pride and joy, the very thing she used to connect with her community, was fundamentally flawed. That's a heavy thing to place on someone's shoulders. I felt like I had taken a mirror she used to see herself as a helpful grandmother and shattered it, forcing her to see a reflection of someone who had unintentionally contributed to the erasure of the doctors who saved her granddaughter's life. Then, about a week later, my husband came home from work, his expression unreadable. He told me that his mother had called him, not to vent, not to cry, but to ask questions. She had apparently spent the last few days doing exactly what I asked. She went to the websites, she read about the funding gap, and she looked up the specific medical outcomes for Children's Minneapolis. She told him that she felt terribly small, and that she realized she had been acting on a surface-level understanding of what it meant to help. She wasn't angry. That was the surprising part. She was ashamed, yes, but it was the kind of shame that leads to growth rather than resentment. She told Mark, "I didn't want to be a part of the problem. I just didn't know the math." Hearing that, I felt a wave of relief that was almost overwhelming, but it was quickly followed by a new, gnawing fear. What does this mean for her social group? She's a shy person, a person who lives for the harmony of that car club. Now she has the burden of the truth, and she has to be the one to carry it to people who might not want to hear it. Is she strong enough to do that? And if she isn't, will she just stop the fundraising altogether, effectively removing our daughter from the narrative entirely? I realized then that by involving her, I had inadvertently shifted the responsibility from me to her. I had asked her to be an advocate. I had asked her to be a voice for CHD awareness in a space that was previously focused on something else. It was a massive request. As I sat with my daughter, watching her play with her colourful blocks, I thought about the sheer weight of that mission. I'm a parent. I'm the one who lived through the trauma, but am I the only one allowed to be the face of this cause? If my mother-in-law decides that the social friction of correcting her friends is too much, and she chooses to just stop the ride, have I actually won? Or have I just silenced a grandmother's way of expressing love? The complexity of it all started to feel like a trap. I wanted the recognition for the cardiac team, yes. I wanted the funding to flow where it was actually needed, absolutely. But at what cost to the people in my life? I started to wonder if I had been so protective of my daughter's story that I had failed to consider the human cost of my own truth-telling. That evening, I decided to reach out to her myself. I didn't want Mark to be the middleman anymore. I sent her a message, not a long, preachy one, but something simple and sincere. I told her that I appreciated her willingness to learn, that I knew it couldn't have been easy, and that I was here if she wanted to talk about it further. I wasn't demanding anything more. I was extending a bridge, hoping that we could navigate this new, uncomfortable territory together. She replied almost immediately, but her message was short. I have a lot to think about. I'll see you soon. That was it. It was so her. It was guarded, but it wasn't cold. It was the sign of a woman who was processing a shift in her own worldview. I felt like I was standing on a precipice, waiting to see if the ground would hold. The stakes felt incredibly high, not just for the charity, not just for the hospital, but for our family. I realized that the hardest part of being a parent to a child with a complex medical history isn't just the doctors and the surgeries. It's the way your life becomes a series of high-stakes negotiations with everyone you love, all to protect the legacy of your child's survival. The days turned into weeks, and the silence in our relationship with my mother-in-law began to take on a different shape. It wasn't the cold, standoffish silence of a grudge. It was a pensive, almost heavy quiet. She wasn't avoiding us. She still came by for her scheduled visits. But the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. She was less likely to talk about her car club friends, and when she did, she didn't mention the St. Jude ride. It was as if she had taken the entire topic and placed it into a box, sealing it shut until she could figure out how to navigate the new reality I presented to her. I spent a lot of time watching her. She was still that same shy, awkward, deeply kind woman. She still brought the thoughtful, tiny gifts for our daughter, a pair of soft, knitted socks, a new board book. But she seemed to be walking on eggshells. I felt a pang of profound sadness every time I saw it. Had I, in my pursuit of correcting the narrative, stifled the one thing she used to connect with us? Was I being the person who took away her joy, even if that joy was rooted in a misconception? Then, one Tuesday, she showed up at our house with a folder. It wasn't a large folder, just a simple manila one, and her hands were trembling slightly as she set it on the kitchen table. She looked at me, and for the first time since that dinner, her eyes didn't look glassy or overwhelmed. They looked resolved. "I talked to the committee," she whispered, her voice barely audible. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had been terrified of this moment. I had imagined a fallout, her being laughed at or being told she was making a scene, or her simply being too embarrassed to ever go back to that club. "They were surprised," she continued, her hands fidgeting with her sweater. I didn't do a very good job of explaining it at first. I stumbled over the words. I told them about the 40,000 children, and I told them about your daughter's heart and the surgeons at Children's Minneapolis. Some of them looked at me like I was speaking a different language. They didn't understand why it mattered. They kept saying, "But it's for the kids. Isn't it all the same?" She took a shaky breath, and I reached out, placing my hand over hers. She didn't pull away. "I told them it wasn't the same," she said, her voice growing firmer. "I told them that if we're going to use a child's face to raise money, we owe it to that child to be accurate. We owe it to the doctors who saved her. I told them I couldn't be a part of it anymore if we didn't honor the truth." I felt a lump form in my throat, a mix of relief and pride so intense it was dizzying. She had done it. She had stepped out of her comfort zone, her terrified, awkward, social, anxiety-ridden comfort zone, and she had advocated for my daughter, and for the cause, in a room full of people she cared about. "They decided to change the promotional materials," she said, opening the folder. Inside were drafts, new flyers and layouts for the ride. They were still using a photo of a child, but the copy had been changed. It now specifically mentioned the cardiac unit at Children's Minneapolis. They hadn't just removed my daughter's face. They had rewritten the mission of the ride to include congenital heart defects. I looked up at her, and my eyes filled with tears. "You did this," I whispered. She offered a small, shy smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes, but held a kernel of real pride. "I'm not a public speaker," she said, laughing nervously. "I probably made it very awkward for everyone. But I couldn't look at that car or at you, knowing that I hadn't even tried. You were right, she's a heart warrior, and she deserves for the world to know exactly who fought for her. In that moment, the AITA conflict in my mind dissolved. I realized that this wasn't about me versus her, or my truth versus her ignorance. It was about us working together to make sure that the people who save lives, who perform the miracles that allow our daughter to be here, actually get the recognition and the resources they need. It was about turning a mistake into an opportunity for education. But as I sat there, looking at these new corrected flyers, a new thought occurred to me. We often think that advocating for our children is about being loud, about posting on social media, about demanding change from a position of power. But sometimes, the most effective advocacy happens in the quietest, most uncomfortable, and most personal spaces. It happens when someone like my mother-in-law, who would rather do anything than have a confrontation, chooses to speak up because the stakes are simply too high to stay silent. I realized then that the bond between us hadn't been broken. It had been tested and, in a way, strengthened. We had both been forced to be vulnerable. She had to admit she was wrong, and I had to admit that I was scared of the consequences of speaking the truth. We had both come out on the other side. As I hugged her, a real, tight, grateful hug, I thought about all the other families out there, the ones currently sitting in hospital rooms, praying for the next heartbeat, wondering if their story will be heard, or if it will be erased by the massive, impersonal machinery of awareness. If you're in that position, or if you've ever felt like your struggle was being used for a cause that didn't represent you, I want to ask you, what would you do? How do you protect the truth of your story while maintaining the relationships that hold your world together? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, because I've learned that there is no perfect answer, only the courage to try and do better, one conversation at a time. The aftermath of that moment, the feeling of the manila folder in my hands, the weight of the realization that my mother-in-law had actually done it, didn't just bring a sense of closure. It brought a strange, new clarity to my entire life as a parent of a medically complex child. For so long, I had been operating in a state of perpetual defense. I was so used to fighting doctors for better care, fighting insurance companies for coverage, and fighting the crushing anxiety of every cardiac scan, that I had stopped expecting anyone to truly hear me. I had assumed that the world was just a series of roadblocks and that my job was to shove through them. But here was my mother-in-law, a woman who struggled to order a sandwich in a crowded restaurant without feeling overwhelmed, standing in a room full of classic car enthusiasts and challenging the entire premise of their charity. She hadn't done it for fame or for a social media post. She hadn't done it to be a hero. She had done it because I had finally allowed her to see the truth. And in doing so, she became the greatest advocate my daughter could have asked for. It taught me something I think a lot of parents, especially those dealing with trauma, often forget. People are capable of surprising us if we give them the grace to be educated, rather than just the blame to be ashamed. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. I found myself actually engaging with the car club. I went to the meetings, not as a critic, but as a guest. I met the people my mother-in-law had been so nervous to talk to. They weren't bad people. They were just like her. They were well-intentioned, slightly out of their depth, and eager to do something good. They just didn't know what they didn't know. Once they saw the data, once they understood the scale of the 40,000 children affected by congenital heart defects versus the funding they were receiving, their perspective shifted. It wasn't about St. Jude versus Children's Minneapolis anymore. It was about the community realizing that they had the power to make a direct, tangible impact on their own backyard. It was humbling. I had spent months harboring resentment, feeling like I was the only one fighting for the real truth, while in reality, I had been isolating myself from the very people who were capable of helping. I had to confront my own arrogance. I had thought that by keeping my mother-in-law at a distance, I was protecting my daughter's story, but I was actually stifling the growth of a support system. There were still nights, of course, when the fear crept back in. The reality of my daughter's condition didn't change just because we fixed a flyer. She still had those surgeries ahead of her. She still had those scars. She still had that fragile little heart that required such constant, vigilant care. But the feeling of being alone in that battle started to evaporate. I realized that my mother-in-law wasn't just a support system in the sense of dropping off gifts. She was a partner in the advocacy. She was a bridge to a community that I had previously written off as superficial. I remember standing in the parking lot during the St. Jude ride, which they had officially renamed to include Heart Warriors for Children's Minneapolis, watching the cars line up. The decals were new, the colours were bright, and there, on the back of the lead car, was a beautiful, clear and contextually accurate description of why they were riding. It wasn't just a generic, sad-faced picture of a sick kid. It was an acknowledgement of a specific, scientific and deeply human challenge. My daughter was there, sitting in her stroller, blissfully unaware of the entire ordeal. She was just a happy, healthy-looking toddler, laughing at the engine roars, completely oblivious to the fact that she was the catalyst for a fundamental shift in how her grandmother's community approached charity. It made me think about the fragility of life. We spend so much time trying to curate our stories, trying to make sure the world sees us the way we want to be seen. But the real, raw truth of our lives is often found in the most uncomfortable, unpolished moments. It's found when we decide to have the hard conversations, even when our voices shake. It's found when we reach out across the divide of misunderstanding and trust that the other person might just be waiting for a chance to be better. If you're watching this and you're currently in the middle of a struggle, whether it's medical, personal, or familial, I want to tell you this. Don't be afraid to be the one who asks for the truth. Don't be afraid to be the one who demands that your story be told accurately. But also, leave room for people to learn. Give them the chance to see what you see. You might be surprised at who stands up to walk beside you. I'm curious. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have spoken up, or would you have let it go to keep the peace? Do you think the potential for a relationship rift is ever worth the cost of an inconvenient truth? Let me know in the comments. And if you found value in this story, if it's made you think differently about how we advocate for the causes that matter to us, please hit that subscribe button. It helps us keep sharing these stories, and it helps us keep building a community that values the messy, complicated, and deeply human reality of what it means to truly care for one another. We're still in the thick of it, of course. There are more surgeries on the horizon, more doctor's appointments, more sleepless nights watching the monitor. But we're not doing it alone anymore. And that makes all the difference in the world. As I look back on everything, from the moment I first saw that decal on the back of that classic car to where we are now, the most striking thing isn't the victory of the argument. It's the realization of how fragile our perceptions of support really are. Before this, I thought support was just about people being present, about them showing up for holidays and bringing diapers, and about keeping things light and easy to avoid rocking the boat. I thought that as long as my mother-in-law was kind, she was doing her job as a grandparent. But I was wrong. True support, the kind that actually sustains you through the long, dark tunnels of medical trauma, isn't just about comfort. It's about being an ally in the truth. It's about being willing to stand in the uncomfortable silence, to read the hard statistics, and to change your own behavior to honor the reality of the person you love. I think about the 40,000 children diagnosed with congenital heart defects every year. Those are 40,000 stories. 40,000 families sitting in hospital cafeterias, staring into the bottom of styrofoam coffee cups, trying to calculate the cost of a future they aren't even sure is coming. And for so long, I felt like those stories were being muffled by the louder, more recognizable brands of national philanthropy. It's not that the other causes aren't worth fighting for. They absolutely are. But there is a specific, urgent, and often overlooked need for cardiac research. When we misappropriate the face of a heart warrior for a cause that doesn't focus on her specific fight, we aren't just making a minor error. We are participating in a quiet form of erasure. We are telling the world that the type of sickness matters more than the actual lived experience of the patient. But now, thanks to a woman who was terrified to even speak up for herself, we've managed to carve out a little corner of awareness. We've turned a classic car club, of all things, into a group of people who now know the difference between a general charity and a specialised cardiac unit. They know about Children's Minneapolis. They know why the funding gap is a crisis. And more importantly, my mother-in-law knows it too. She isn't just the kind, awkward grandmother anymore. She's become a woman who can hold her own, who can speak with conviction, and who has learned that her voice has power. That is a transformation I never expected, and it's one that has brought us closer than I ever thought possible. There is a lesson here about the masks we wear. We all have them. I had my polite daughter-in-law mask, the one that kept me from saying what I really thought because I didn't want to be that person. My mother-in-law had her socially awkward but kind mask, which kept her from questioning the status quo because she didn't want to be the difficult one. We were both hiding behind these personas, and in doing so, we were keeping each other at arm's length. It took a crisis, the realization that our daughter's image was being used to represent something she wasn't, to finally drop those masks. It was painful, it was messy, and it left us both feeling exposed. But there is a special kind of strength that comes from being truly seen by the people you love. I've been asked by friends and family if I'm worried about the future. Of course I am. The surgeries are coming. The road ahead is long, and there will be more days where I feel like I'm drowning in a sea of medical terminology and hospital bills. But the difference is that I no longer feel like I have to carry the burden of politeness on top of the burden of parenting. I've learned that when you speak the truth with love, even when it's hard, you create a space for other people to be better. You give them a chance to step up, to be counted, and to show you who they really are. If you are currently struggling with a difficult conversation, if you're holding on to a truth that you're afraid will burn bridges, I want to encourage you to think about the foundation of your relationships. If a relationship is truly strong, it can withstand the fire of a hard truth. And if it can't, maybe it wasn't the kind of relationship you needed to protect in the first place. But more often than not, the people we love are waiting for us to trust them with the truth. They are waiting for us to say, "This is what I need, and this is why it matters." And when we give them that chance, they often surprise us in the most beautiful ways. My daughter is sleeping in the next room. Her heartbeat, that tiny, miraculous, surgically repaired drum, is steady. It's a sound I'll never take for granted. I know that the world is big and often indifferent, and I know that the machinery of awareness can be cold and impersonal. But I also know that in my own little corner of the world, we've made a change. We've honoured the people who saved her life, and we've made sure that her story is hers to tell, not ours to commodify. I'm so grateful for everyone who has followed this journey, for those of you who have shared your own stories, and for the people who continue to advocate for the things that matter most. We are all just trying to get through the day, trying to do the right thing, and trying to protect the people we love. If we can do that with a little more honesty, a little more courage, and a little more willingness to be uncomfortable, I think the world might just be a better place for all of us. It's funny how, in the middle of a storm, you think the objective is simply to stay afloat. You think that if you can just keep the boat from capsizing, everything else is secondary. But after months of navigating the choppy waters of medical advocacy, I've realized that the true objective isn't just surviving. It's making sure that, when the storm finally breaks, you know exactly who was in the boat with you. My mother-in-law was in the boat, but for a long time, we were looking in different directions. She was looking at the horizon, searching for a way to be helpful, and I was looking at the hole in the hull, trying to patch it up before we took on too much water. We were both working toward the same goal, but our methods were clashing because we hadn't taken the time to truly speak the same language. That language, I've discovered, is the language of radical honesty. It's not about being aggressive, it's about being transparent. When I finally stopped worrying about being polite and started being truthful, I realized that she wasn't actually the person I had built her up to be in my head. The fragile, easily broken woman who couldn't handle a hard truth. She was a resilient, thoughtful, and deeply committed grandmother who had just been operating under a set of assumptions that hadn't been challenged yet. When I gave her the data, when I showed her the heartbreaking reality of how congenital heart defects are sidelined in the funding world, she didn't just understand, she acted. And that action, that little bit of activism in a small town social club, created a ripple effect that I never anticipated. It wasn't just about the flyer, it was about the conversations that happened afterward. People started asking questions. Why does this matter? What is a CHD? Who are these surgeons? Suddenly, my daughter wasn't just a face on a car, she was the reason for a shift in perspective. And that, in its own way, is its own kind of miracle. If I could reach back in time and talk to that version of myself, the one sitting at the kitchen table a year ago, staring at a phone and feeling that hot, sharp sting of resentment, I'd tell her to breathe. I'd tell her that the confrontation she's dreading isn't a death knell for the relationship. It's a hurdle that, once cleared, makes the relationship stronger. I'd tell her that she doesn't have to carry the weight of her daughter's story all by herself. She just has to be brave enough to invite others into the truth. This experience has fundamentally changed how I view my own role as a parent. I used to think that being an advocate meant I had to be the loudest voice in the room. I thought it meant I had to be the one on the megaphone, the one writing the angry emails, the one constantly on the defensive. But I've learned that the most effective advocacy is often the kind that happens at a kitchen table, over a cup of tea, with someone you love. It's the kind that is rooted in connection rather than conflict. We're still in the thick of it, of course. Tomorrow there's another checkup, next month there's a scan, and in the years to come there will be more surgeries. The medical journey for a heart warrior is a marathon, not a sprint. But I look at my daughter today, and I see the joy in her eyes, the sheer, unadulterated happiness of a child who doesn't know she's a medical case. She just knows she's loved. And she's surrounded by a village that has learned, through our messy, uncomfortable, and deeply human process, that she is more than a symbol. She is a person, and her story is worth telling with precision, with respect, and with the full weight of the truth. If there's anything I want you to take away from this, it's that your voice matters. Whether you're fighting for a cause, defending your child, or just trying to navigate the complex dynamics of family life, your perspective is a tool for change. Don't be afraid to use it, and don't be afraid to trust the people around you to grow. You might find that the very people you were most worried about are the ones who will stand with you when it counts the most. So, here's my question to all of you. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between keeping the peace and speaking your truth? How did it change your relationships? And looking back, would you have done it any differently? Share your experiences in the comments. I think there's so much power in hearing how others have navigated these moments of friction. And if you've enjoyed this look into our life, please subscribe. We have so much more to share, and having you on this journey with us makes the road ahead feel just a little bit brighter. We are, all of us, works in progress. We are all learning how to navigate the complexities of being human. And we are all, in our own way, trying to make sure that the people we love are honoured, supported, and truly seen. And I think that's a pretty good place to start. The beauty of this whole messy experience is that it didn't end with a grand cinematic crescendo, but with a quiet, persistent change in the way we move through the world. It's been months since that folder first appeared on our kitchen table, and in that time, something profound has taken root in our family. My mother-in-law, once the woman who would avoid a conversation about the weather if it risked being awkward, has become a genuine force of nature in her social circle. She doesn't just talk about the ride anymore, she talks about the anatomy of a heart defect. She talks about the statistics. She talks about children's Minneapolis with the kind of fierce, informed pride that usually belongs to the doctors themselves. It's a strange thing, witnessing someone you've known for years undergo a transformation you never thought they were capable of. I used to look at her through the lens of my own impatience. I saw her hesitance and I labelled it as weakness. I saw her lack of knowledge and I labelled it as indifference. How wrong I was. What I mistook for fragility was actually just a lack of context. People often treat children's charities like a generic, feel-good industry. They don't understand that for parents like us, it's not about charity in the abstract. It's about the specific, brutal survival of the person we love most in the world. When you give people the chance to understand that, when you stop protecting them from the uncomfortable truth, they often surprise you by picking up a sword and joining the battle. There's a comfort in that. The road ahead for my daughter is still marked by medical hurdles, by the inevitable surgeries, by the moments where we'll have to sit in that waiting room again and hold our breath. But the loneliness of that road has diminished. I no longer feel like I'm standing on one side of a wall, trying to explain a language that no one else speaks. I have a partner in this, someone who is willing to get her hands dirty and fight for the recognition of the people who saved our daughter. If you are a parent out there, sitting in a hospital room, feeling like the world doesn't understand, or like your struggle is being repackaged into something more palatable for a donor, I want you to hear this. You have the right to claim your story. You have the right to insist on accuracy. And you don't have to be a villain to do it. You don't have to be the bad guy who ruins the nice event. You can be the person who educates, who leads, and who opens the door to a deeper level of understanding. It's hard, yes. It requires you to be vulnerable, to expose your own resentment, and to potentially risk the comfort of your relationships. But the payoff? It's a connection that is built on something much stronger than polite silence. It's built on shared conviction. We're moving forward now, one heartbeat at a time. The car club is planning another ride, and this time the brochures are printed with the official logo of the cardiac unit. There's no more confusion. There's no more generic sick kid marketing. There is only a clear, honest, and respectful acknowledgement of the battle being fought in our city every single day. My mother-in-law is even talking about organising a tour of the hospital for some of her friends, so they can see the facility, meet the staff, and understand the work that goes into every single recovery. She's become an advocate, and in doing so, she's become a better grandmother. She isn't just giving toys anymore. She's giving a voice to the cause that keeps her granddaughter alive. As I close this chapter, I find myself looking at my daughter, not with the fear I used to feel, but with a sense of quiet confidence. She is a survivor, and she is surrounded by people who have learned, through our messy, uncomfortable, and deeply human process, that she is more than a symbol. She is a person whose life matters, whose story is unique, and whose future is worth fighting for. And if we can do that, if we can turn a conflict into a community, then maybe we can do anything. Thank you for listening to my story. It wasn't an easy one to tell, and it certainly wasn't an easy one to live. But it's the story of us, of the way we learn to stop hiding, stop pretending, and start truly seeing each other. If you've ever felt like your voice was being muffled, or like you were being forced to compromise on your values for the sake of keeping the peace, I hope this has given you a little bit of courage to speak your truth. You deserve to be heard, and your story deserves to be told exactly as it happened. If you have a story of your own, or if you've had to navigate a similar conflict, I really do want to know what you think. Drop a comment below. I'll be reading them all. And if you want to keep following along as we navigate this journey, as we prepare for what comes next, please hit that subscribe button. It's not just about clicks. It's about building a community of people who care about the real, raw reality of what it means to be a heart family. We're in this together. And honestly, that's all any of us can really ask for.